Okay, let's unpack this stack of sources you've given us.
Right.
Navigating the sheer volume of information out there, especially on complex health topics like new medical technologies, can feel overwhelming.
It really can.
Ah,
Information overload is definitely real.
Sometimes getting a handle on things means looking closely at the specific concerns being raised by some researchers and clinicians, really digging past the most common narratives.
Exactly. And what's fascinating in this material you've shared is how it focuses on mechanisms of potential impact that differ from typical vaccine side effects.
How so?
Well, it really zeroes in on the design of the technology itself and specific observations reported by, some practitioners and individuals.
Absolutely. So, our mission today, based on these specific articles, reviews, and observational reports you've handed over,
Hmm.
is to deeply explore the concerns raised within this material regarding mRNA COVID-19 vaccines. We've got expert analyses here, discussions citing researchers like Dr. Senef, Mikovits, and Corey,
Right. Familiar names in certain circles.
and reports on what some are apparently seeing in clinical practice. So, we're diving into a particular viewpoint presented in these documents.
And it's really crucial to frame this correctly, I think. Our goal is to neutrally present the claims and information found within these specific sources.
Exactly. Just report what's in them.
We are conveying the ideas and observations these documents contain, not, validating or endorsing them. We're simply exploring what this particular material puts forward.
Right. Okay, let's start with what these sources present as a foundational concern. The engineered spike protein itself.
Yeah, that seems to be the starting point in most of these papers. They begin by explaining the basic mechanism.
Which is?
The mRNA vaccines instruct your cells to produce the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. That's the core idea.
Okay. And a key claim raised in this material is that the engineered spike protein produced by the vaccine isn't quite the same as the spike protein on the natural virus.
That's a central point they make, yes.
So what differences do these sources highlight?
Well, they detail several specific properties of the engineered version. One is that it's described as being stabilized in an open conformation.
Open conformation. What does that mean in simple terms?
It means basically it doesn't fold back into the cell membrane in the way the natural one might after binding. It sort of stays exposed.
Okay, so it's presented as staying in a more active state, potentially.
That's the implication discussed, yeah. These sources also suggest it binds particularly tightly to the ACE2 receptor.
And ACE2 receptors are everywhere, right? Lungs, heart, blood vessels.
Pretty much. And these sources claim that by binding so tightly, it essentially disables or interferes with this receptor's normal function.
Which could lead to problems.
They link this within the sources to potential dysfunction in vascular, cardiac, and neurological systems. That's the connection they draw.
And they also raise concerns about the amount and duration of protein production. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. The material points to the high GC content. That's a technical term for the RNA sequence in the synthetic RNA used in the vaccines.
And what's the significance of that, according to them?
According to these sources, this leads to excessive and, importantly, prolonged production of the spike protein by the body's cells,
How long are we talking?
potentially for weeks or even months, which they claim far exceeds the more transient production you'd see during a typical natural infection.
So the concern highlighted in these sources isn't just making the spike protein, but making a potentially modified version,
Right.
possibly in much larger quantities and for much longer periods based on the claims in these documents.
Precisely. And these unique properties, as they describe them, are presented as contributing to significant downstream effects.
Such as?
The sources mention inflammation and mitochondrial damage as potential consequences.
Okay. And there are concerns raised about something called prion-like behavior. That sounds serious.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Referencing the work of researchers like Dr. Senef, these sources suggest that the structure and properties of the engineered spike protein raise questions about its potential to misfold and aggregate.
Like proteins do in prion diseases.
In ways similar to prion diseases, yes. The concern expressed is that this could potentially predispose individuals to neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's.
Wow. But this is presented as more of a theoretical risk based on structure.
It's presented as a theoretical possibility based on structural analysis and some observed pathologies in the material, yeah. Not definitive proof, but a concern they raise.
Got it. So in the context of this material, understanding the specific claims about the engineered spike protein's nature is presented as crucial because it's seen as the root cause.
The root cause of the potential issues discussed later in the documents.
That's correct. It's framed as the key difference from natural infection that leads to the other potential harms they describe.
Okay, Moving on from the protein itself, this material also delves into how it believes these vaccines might impact the body's immune system.
Right. This is another major theme. These sources assert that the vaccines appear to suppress the type I interferon pathway.
And that pathway is important. Oh, absolutely. It's a fundamental part of your body's innate or immediate defense against viruses, like the first responders.
Okay. And what do these sources claim are the consequences of suppressing that pathway?
According to the material, this suppression may allow dormant or latent viruses that are already in your body, things you might not even know you have to reactivate.
Like what kind of viruses?
Herpes, varicella, that's the virus that causes chickenpox and shingles, and Epstein-Barr virus, are specifically mentioned as examples.
Huh. So these sources suggest a mechanism for why some people might report flare-ups of conditions like shingles after vaccination.
That's the proposed link within this material, yes. The sources also connect this immune impact to outcomes like immune exhaustion and chronic inflammation.
Immune exhaustion.
Yeah, like the immune system gets worn out. They suggest it can skew the immune system, potentially favoring dysfunctional antibody production over the kind of cellular immunity often needed to clear infected cells effectively.
The sources mention Dr. Judy Mikovits in relation to this immune dysfunction. What comparison does she reportedly draw?
As discussed in these documents, Dr. Makovits' analysis suggests that this type of immune system disruption resembles the breakdown seen in conditions like AIDS or chronic fatigue syndrome, MECFS.
That's a strong comparison.
It is. Her view, as presented in the sources, is that vaccine injury might mimic or even induce syndromes like that.
It's a very significant claim raised in the material. The sources also touch on a sensitive scientific point: the possibility of genomic integration.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the more controversial points discussed. It's presented as a complex theoretical possibility.
What's the theory?
The sources raise the idea of reverse transcription. That's where the vaccine mRNA could potentially be converted into DNA.
RNA back to DNA.
Exactly. And then that DNA copy could theoretically be integrated into the host cell's genome, into your own DNA.
And they note this idea potentially contradicts earlier statements from some authorities.
Yes. The documents claim that while initial official information suggested this was impossible, studies cited within these sources, including some animal and lab-based work, indicate that it is a possibility that, in their view, warrants investigation.
How do they suggest this might happen biologically?
They propose it could be facilitated by the body's own endogenous reverse transcriptase enzymes.
Enzymes we already have.
Yes, naturally occurring enzymes in human cells that can actually perform this RNA to DNA conversion.
Right.
It's part of our normal biology, used for other things.
And what do the sources say about the implications if this did happen?
Well, the sources state that the implications of this theoretical genomic integration remain largely unstudied, but they raise serious questions, including bioethical concerns and potential long-term safety considerations from the perspective presented in this material. They present it as a possibility based on biological mechanisms and some preliminary findings.
Not as something proven to be widespread.
Not as a widely proven event, no, but definitely a concern highlighted in these documents.
Okay, so we've explored the claimed issues with the protein itself and the potential impacts on the immune system and DNA, according to these sources. Now, let's delve into what is perhaps the most discussed and controversial topic in this stack of documents: the phenomenon referred to as vaccine shedding.
Right. This comes up a lot in the material. As the term is used and discussed in these sources, vaccine shedding refers to reports from unvaccinated individuals.
People who didn't get the shot.
Correct. Who describe experiencing illness or various symptoms after having close contact with people who have received the mRNA vaccines.
And the sources themselves acknowledge this is a challenging area, kind of hard to pin down.
Absolutely. The material describes this phenomenon as troubling and poorly understood. The authors recognize that presenting this as a real occurrence is difficult, partly because there is, and they quote, still no agreed-upon mechanism for it within mainstream scientific understanding.
They quote a Midwestern doctor source on that.
That's right. And they are very clear that this is not viral shedding in the traditional sense.
Meaning it's not like someone shedding the live virus itself.
Exactly. No live virus replication and transmission is being claimed here. It's something else they're proposing.
So if it's not traditional viral shedding, what mechanisms do these sources propose to explain how something might be transferring and causing symptoms?
Okay, the primary theory discussed is exosome transfer.
Exosomes? What are those again?
They're tiny membrane-bound vesicles, like little bubbles or packages that cells naturally release and take in. They act like a communication network within the body.
Okay.
According to the sources, vaccinated individuals produce exosomes that contain the engineered spike protein.
So the spike protein gets packaged up.
That's the idea. The theory is that these spike protein-containing exosomes could then be transferred to unvaccinated individuals through various routes.
Like tiny delivery systems for the spike protein.
That's the concept presented, yes. The sources suggest potential transfer routes include inhalation, breathing them in, via sweat, saliva, other bodily fluids, or even breast milk. The idea is that these exosomes, studded with spike protein, could then activate immune responses or cause pathology in the recipient.
Right. What about the DNA plasmid contamination theory mentioned in the sources? That sounds different.
Yes, this is presented as another potential hypothesis. This theory, discussed in the material, suggests that trace amounts of circular DNA plasmids.
Leftovers from manufacturing?
Potentially, yes. From the vaccine manufacturing process might sometimes remain in the final product. It posits that these plasmids could potentially integrate into the recipient's genome or, interestingly, their microbiome.
The bacteria living in us.
Exactly. The community of bacteria living in and on us. According to this hypothesis, if integrated into bacteria, those bacteria could then potentially produce and shed vaccine components.
Like the spike protein.
Other components, yeah, leading to a form of transfer.
That hypothesis links back to the idea of genetic material being incorporated, but here suggesting bacteria could be the source of shedding components.
It's another angle they explore.
Are any other theories mentioned in the sources? Any more out there ideas?
Well, one source briefly touches on highly speculative theories, like pathologically altered mutagenic radiation or pheromones, but presents these as much less developed ideas compared to the exosome or plasmid theories.
Okay, so those are the proposed mechanisms according to these sources. What evidence do they actually cite for this phenomenon occurring? Do they offer proof?
Well, proof is a strong word, but they point to several lines of evidence as they see it. First, they mention a large volume of anecdotal reports.
Stories from people.
Yes, observational data shared directly by individuals who believe they have experienced symptoms after contact with vaccinated people. Patient self-reports are definitely part of the picture presented.
Okay, what else?
Crucially, the sources also highlight clinical observations from practitioners treating vaccine injuries. They specifically mentioned the experiences reported by Drs. Corey and Marsland.
And what are they reporting?
According to these documents, these doctors have seen a significant number of patients develop symptoms consistent with spike protein pathology, similar to long COVID or confirmed vaccine injury.
But in unvaccinated people.
Yes, specifically after close contact with vaccinated individuals. They report that these symptoms often improve when contact with a suspected shedder is reduced, or when the shedder is treated with therapies aimed at spike protein toxicity like ivermectin or nattokinase.
So that sounds like medical professionals observing patterns in their practice, as reported in these sources.
That's as presented, yes.
Is there any more formal data cited, like studies?
The sources reference a 2023 peer-reviewed study. Now, their interpretation of this study is that it showed unvaccinated individuals in close contact with vaccinated people developed an immune response to the spike protein.
An immune response, like antibodies.
The specifics of the response might vary, but the authors of the sources argue that this finding provides objective evidence that some component capable of eliciting an immune reaction is being transferred from vaccinated to unvaccinated individuals.
Interesting interpretation. Does this material suggest that everyone experiences this potential shedding in the same way? Or is it different for different people?
No, definitely not the same.
Yeah.
The sources strongly emphasize that sensitivity to this reported phenomenon varies immensely among unvaccinated individuals.
Some feel it more than others.
Dramatically so, according to them. They suggest that those most sensitive may already be aware of it. The material outlines 3 overlapping categories of individuals who might be particularly susceptible based on their observations.
Who are they?
First, those with pre-existing chronic illnesses or sensitivities. Second, those who have been sensitized by a previous vaccine injury or long COVID.
So prior experience makes them more sensitive.
Potentially, according to this viewpoint. And third, individuals whose immune systems are less effective at neutralizing the spike protein after exposure, for whatever reason.
Okay. So A person's underlying health or previous exposure history might play a role in their sensitivity, according to these sources. Let's get more specific. How do the sources describe the ways people report being exposed? What are the routes?
According to the material, the most frequently reported route is just general proximity, being near someone.
So, likely through breathing the same air, respiratory.
That's the likely assumption, yes. However, they also discuss exposure through skin-to-skin contact, potentially via sweat.
Skin contact.
Yeah. And one striking anecdotal case mentioned to the sources is of a cancer reportedly developing at the specific site of skin contact.
Wow. That's a very specific and severe report mentioned in the sources. What about other bodily fluids?
The sources mention potential exposure via other secretions like breast milk and semen. They cite reports linking acute symptoms, including menstrual disturbances and abdominal pain, specifically to sexual transmission and ingestion of semen.
Really? That's specific.
That's what's reported here. One document even refers to a claim by a pathologist, Dr. Arne Burkhardt, about spike protein reportedly being found in semen, in some cases apparently replacing sperm.
Replacing sperm, that's quite a claim.
It is indeed a claim noted in the source material.
And they discuss environmental exposure as well, like surfaces.
Yes, the sources include reports of potential exposure through environmental contamination. They mention cleaners becoming ill after handling laundry from vaccinated individuals, for instance.
Laundry.
That's the report. One source even describes a slightly yellowish tint supposedly observed on contaminated sheets.
Disturbing details presented in the sources. What about the timing? If someone is exposed, how quickly do symptoms reportedly appear?
The sources describe varying timing patterns. Some highly sensitive individuals report an almost immediate reaction, or very quickly. Others report a more common delay of maybe 6 to 24 hours. And in some reported severe cases, symptoms might develop after a longer delay.
And the symptoms themselves. The sources list a wide array, you said.
They do, and they often categorize them based on frequency or type. Probably the most commonly reported symptoms linked to this shedding exposure in these sources are gynecologic issues.
Affecting women.
Primarily women, yes. Particularly menstrual abnormalities affecting women of all ages, apparently.
What kind of menstrual issues are mentioned specifically?
The sources detail a real range, things like short-term and long-term changes to cycles. They mention unusual cases like postmenopausal bleeding or even bleeding in women who no longer have a uterus.
How is that possible?
It's reported as happening in these sources. The mechanism isn't fully explained. The phenomenon of decidual cast shedding.
What's that?
It's where the entire uterine lining is expelled as a single piece. It's highlighted in the sources, noting its extreme historical rarity, but claiming a concerning frequency in a survey they cite related to this context. Concerns about increased miscarriage risk after exposure are also presented, including specific report counts mentioned in the material.
So, a lot of focus on female reproductive health issues.
The sources claim women appear significantly more sensitive than men. Men less frequently report symptoms, though groin pain is noted as a potential less common equivalent.
The detail on the gynecologic symptoms is quite specific in the sources. What other common symptoms are listed?
Many common symptoms are linked in the sources to what they describe as blood stasis or issues with blood flow.
Like clotting or circulation problems?
Kind of. Symptoms like headaches, sometimes described very vividly, like a nail through the head feeling, tinnitus, ringing in the ears, and bruising.
Bruising.
Both tiny, sort of immune-related bruises and larger, painless ones are reported. Dizziness is also frequently mentioned.
And symptoms related to the immune system itself, like feeling sick.
Yes. Common immune-related symptoms reported include mental cloudiness or brain fog, a general flu-like feeling, fatigue, joint pain, catching COVID-like illnesses, and reactivation of latent infections.
Like the shingles example again?
Shingles is frequently cited in this context as well, yes.
What about rarer, more severe events? The sources mention some concerning anecdotes.
Yes. While presented as rarer occurrences after shedding compared to direct vaccination, the sources do list other reported symptoms. Things like AFib, muscle pain, seizures, insomnia, hair loss, sinus pressure and discharge, various skin rashes.
Oh, real mix.
And they also include discussions of anecdotal severe events, signs of stroke, blood clots, PMR, that's polymyalgia rheumatica, fatal seizures.
Fatal.
One specific anecdote mentions a fatal seizure reportedly occurring after a Thanksgiving dinner with vaccinated family members. And unusual cancers, like the one we mentioned earlier, reportedly at a site of skin contact.
Wow. But they acknowledge these are hard to link definitively.
The sources acknowledge the difficulty in proving these links, yes, but they present these as concerning observations from their material.
There's also the distinct and, frankly, unusual phenomenon of a specific odor reported around vaccinated individuals.
Yes, the sources delve into this quite a bit, as reported by some sensitive individuals. One source shares detailed observations from a physician who reports perceiving a distinct odor around vaccinated people.
An odor? What's it described like?
Well, the physician reportedly noted it emerged in late 2020 or early 2021. They say it's strongest in hospital settings, reportedly worsens after booster doses, varies geographically in intensity,
Strange.
and is suspected by them to be linked to the spike protein combined with something else. This odor is reported to cause temporary symptoms in sensitive individuals who smell it.
Symptoms just from the smell.
That's the claim, and it apparently aligns with observations reported within some communities sensitive to mold biotoxins. It's described as detectable simply by breathing the air nearby.
Any theories on what causes the smell?
It's speculated by some in the sources to potentially be pheromonal, but that's just speculation. They even reference the possibility of training dogs to detect it, citing research on COVID-sniffing dogs as sort of analogous.
That is certainly a unique and detailed report from the source material. Okay, let's transition slightly. What do these sources discuss regarding the regulatory context and potential strategies for mitigation or natural recovery?
Right. The sources raise concerns about regulatory oversight regarding these specific issues, particularly shedding. They assert that regulatory bodies did not require shedding studies for the mRNA vaccines,
Even though they were new technology.
even though they classified them, according to these sources, as gene therapy products.
And they claim gene therapies typically do require shedding studies.
That is the claim made in the sources, yes. They cite examples of approved gene therapies like Luxturna, Roctavian, and Zolgensma, where shedding of the viral vectors was studied.
And precautions were recommended.
Precautions regarding exposure via fluids like tears, semen, or feces were included in prescribing information for those therapies, according to these documents.
What else?
The sources also point to Pfizer's own clinical trial protocol document.
What about it?
They claim it included a section noting the theoretical risk of exposure to pregnant women via skin contact or inhalation from vaccinated individuals. The sources assert that this internal acknowledgement of risk was not publicly disclosed or followed up with dedicated shedding studies.
So the sources claim there were regulatory omissions and unaddressed internal concerns about potential transfer.
That's the argument presented in this material.
Okay. Given the range of concerns raised in these documents, what do they suggest in terms of potential approaches for mitigation or supporting the body's natural processes?
Yeah.
What can people do, according to them?
Well, the sources recommend various holistic and pharmacologic interventions based on the perspective of the authors and cited practitioners. These are aimed at addressing what they see as spike protein toxicity and related issues.
Like what?
Things like strategies to activate autophagy.
Autophagy. Cell cleanup.
Exactly. The body's natural process for cleaning out damaged components. They suggest practices like time-restricted eating, intermittent fasting, and sauna use could help the body process or remove the spike protein.
Interesting. What specific supplements or treatments are mentioned in the sources?
The sources list quite a range of anti-inflammatory and antiviral nutraceuticals that they suggest could be helpful. Things like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine.
Controversial ones.
Yes. Also milk thistle, cannabis, and betaine. They also recommend proteolytic enzymes.
Enzymes that break down proteins.
Exactly. Like nattokinase and nepenol AFD, they suggest these may help break down spike protein aggregates in the body.
And what about general lifestyle advice from these sources? Diet, things like that.
The general advice presented includes recommendations to avoid further vaccinations naturally, minimize exposure to GMO products and synthetic cosmetics, and carefully consider pharmaceuticals that might suppress immune function.
There are things to do.
They emphasize supporting innate immunity, optimizing diet, focusing on metabolic flexibility, organic and sulfur-rich foods, ensuring sufficient vitamin D, getting sensible sunlight exposure, time-restricted eating again, and using Epsom salt baths.
Are there any other specific remedies mentioned in the sources for addressing these issues, more targeted things?
Other remedies mentioned in the context of addressing immune dysregulation or latent virus activation include things like low-dose antiretroviral therapy, low-dose interferons like Paximune.
These sound more like prescription-level things.
Amar, yes. Also peptide T, cannabis again, DMG betaine, and silymarin milk thistle come up.
And for potentially cleaning environments exposed to shedding, did they mention anything for that?
Just briefly, the sources mention environmental cleaning methods they consider potentially helpful, such as using UVC light and hypochlorous acid.
Okay. Finally, the sources also touch on practical considerations for navigating potentially sensitive social or medical situations, like dating or blood transfusions, given these concerns.
Yes, the material provides advice from the perspective presented. For dating, for example, they note that sensitivity varies greatly.
So it depends on the person.
Right. They advise taking things slow, suggest considering avoidance of direct contact with semen due to the potential for transmission discussed earlier.
Okay.
They acknowledge the awkward possibility of individuals not being truthful about vaccination status, and even mention reports of sensitive individuals experiencing a loss of attraction to vaccinated people.
Loss of attraction, that's specific.
It's a specific point mentioned in the material, yes, regarding blood transfusions.
Yeah, what about that?
The sources express concerns about the general blood supply and the logistical difficulties of accessing unvaccinated blood if someone wanted it. They mention alternatives for elective surgery like self-donation, but note the challenge in emergencies.
And they mention potential problems with vaccinated blood.
They reference rare but reported injuries from vaccinated blood discussed in the material, yes.
Right. Well, this deep dive has certainly walked us through the concerns raised in your sources. We covered the engineered spike protein's claimed unique properties and potential toxicity, the reported impacts on the immune system, the possibility of genomic integration as discussed in the material,
A complex topic.
and the multifaceted phenomenon of shedding, as reported and theorized within these specific documents, the mechanisms, the evidence cited, the symptoms.
And we've really focused entirely on extracting and presenting the claims, observations, and theories contained within the source material you provided.
Exactly, just laying out what's in these papers.
And these documents themselves, they conclude by calling for deeper scientific scrutiny, transparent data sharing, and individualized approaches to health based on the concerns they raise.
Right. It's a detailed look at one specific viewpoint as presented in a particular set of documents. Given the wide range of reported experiences discussed in these sources and the complex biological mechanisms they propose, it raises an important question for you, the listener. How do we as individuals evaluate information and make informed choices when faced with deeply conflicting scientific viewpoints and observations that may fall outside what is commonly accepted or understood?